Hi, it's Joy Foster, founder of Tech Pixies and the host of the Sparkle and Thrive podcast. And I'm really excited today to have a guest who has a very unique background, but also, like me, started a podcast when he didn't know who was going to listen or what he was going to say. So, welcome to the podcast, Alec Chisnell. I'm so glad you're here. Let's start with your famous connection, which I don't actually know Richard Branson, but he is from Oxfordshire, and I know his son and possibly his daughter went to schools here in Oxford. So you know Richard Branson. Tell us the story.
Yeah, he used to be my boss basically for two businesses that I work for. So Virgin Atlantic, which I spent 17 years working with Richard, and then Virgin Startup, which was very different but super exciting, which is his not-for-profit that helps startups get funding, get mentored. You used to see a lot of him back in the day when we worked for the airline, not so much with Virgin Startup, given he now lives on an island in the middle of the Caribbean. But we used to see him. We used to host parties at his home in Kidlington in Oxfordshire, and we all used to go and camp in his garden. And yeah, I've got a really funny story of my brother who I took to that event, just wandering into Richard's house and sitting down, putting the TV on, and his wife making my brother a sandwich. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning or something like that, and he didn't even realize that sat there watching a boxing match with Richard on the TV at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was like, oh my god, what did you do? That's the boss's house, for crying out loud. At this point, Richard not only owned an airline at the age of 40, but he owned a record company that had the likes of the Rolling Stones on the label. So I've got a few good stories like that from Richards. Back in the day, used to host parties down route in LA. We'd have like room parties and stuff like that, and go out. He'd just take us out to clubs and just put his card behind the bar and pay for everybody's drink. So he was a very generous boss to have. So some of that entrepreneurialism must have rubbed off on me over the years, basically.
Well, what I'm curious about is how, a lot of people who listen to this podcast, they are, women with lots of different aspirations, and they're coming from various different points in their career. So your career started at Virgin Atlantic as a flight attendant. Is that right? So
Yes.
how
Yeah.
did you transfer from a flight attendant to your ongoing role there to now what you're doing, which is podcasting and entrepreneurship?
Yeah, so I started after university. I went to BBC Radio Wales, so I did start out in audio. So I kind of feel like I've come through this, full circle journey where podcasting is more popular than radio now, right? So um, I love travel. I used to spend my summers at university going to the States and coaching at summer camps at Connecticut, like tennis and soccer, etc. So I had that love of travel. And I started out as a flight attendant, as you rightly say, and then I just worked my way up as far as I could go to a management position. And then I just always had this itch that I wanted to scratch, and I think just seeing the different businesses that he was starting at the time, I just had that urge to be my own boss. So I left, and this is probably iteration number 4. So I have my own podcast, as you mentioned, Screw It, Just Do It. Off the back of that, I launched my own podcast agency. So we now make podcasts for different brands, different individuals. But in between there was a time when, I went back. My wife always said to me, you'll always go back to Virgin. And she was right. So I did go back for about 3.5 years to Virgin Startup, which was as a mentor, then a business advisor, and then as a delivery partner for the government startup loan scheme. And that's when I really became interested in the startup scene in the UK.
Well,
Used to
Tech
host
Pixies
live events.
benefited from that loan scheme because we at one point, I mean, I've used lots of different vehicles to build Tech Pixies, but one of those was the startup loan scheme.
Oh, brilliant.
And I remember when I paid it off, and I was so proud of
I
proud of
bet.
myself. It took me like
Amazing.
5 years to do it, but I remember paying it off and being very proud.
Yeah.
And so that was that, and I definitely use that vehicle. So it's interesting though, because I did some work for Sherry Kutu, helping her build a charity called Founders for Schools, and that was my exposure to that really entrepreneurial world. And I do think it is incredible. Like, I had no concept, and it sounds really weird to say this now on the other side of the journey, but as I was going to school, I had no concept of entrepreneurship and that companies were owned by people, and that there were, like, I just didn't understand any of that until, of course, I'm out in the real world, and I'm working for other people, and then I get the bug, like you said, sort of that urge to build something of your own. And it was inspired by, I was doing all the social media and all the blogging and all the event organization for Founders for Schools. We were using technology to do it, but they still needed a human element. Those were the days. And I would hear all these entrepreneurial stories and all these amazing stories. And of course, was introduced to Richard Branson's story and several other stories. And it was very inspirational. And I think what was exciting was going out on my own and building my own thing. And I've sort of built 3 companies now. This is my 3rd one, and the most successful one by far. But I think it's what's interesting is how podcasting has been a vehicle for building a business, which I hadn't anticipated. So, having a podcast yourself and then having created a podcasting agency, what's the deal with podcasting? Why is it so important, in 2023? And maybe if you know a little bit about the history of it, I mean, as far as I know, there's around, in the United Kingdom, there's about 15 million podcast listeners. It's exploded the last few years, partly due to the pandemic. But you said it's more popular than radio. I teach it as one of the 3 methods by which you can reach people: podcasting, video, and blogging. And I sort of say, well, you can do all 3. You can do a video podcast like we're doing here. You can then embed that on your website with show notes, which is effectively your blog. And you could sort of do all 3 at the same time. But I encourage people to pick at least one of the 3 mediums. But there's something really magical about podcasting, especially when you stick with it and you don't give up. And so what's your take on it, and why is it so important for people?
Yeah, and congratulations. I see you're about to hit episode 200 at the time of recording this, and I know
this is episode 200, by the way. You get the honor and privilege. I thought we might as well do episode 200 about podcasting.
Amazing. That makes perfect sense to me. So I'm privileged and honored. So thank you. And I know what it's like. I've reached 514 with mine, and I know that consistency is key, and it's just turning up every day and doing it, even when sometimes you might not feel like doing it. And even, I've been podcasting 6.5 years, but you still have those moments where you doubt it. And especially to start with, like you, I started the podcast and two listeners in week 1, 2 listeners, and you just think.
So you said your mom and who?
Oh, that was me assuming it was my mum or my wife. Yeah, and me. But it's interesting. Like I posted something on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago after doing some research, and it was like, out of and I think it lists, Apple has like 4 million podcasts listed, and Spotify has 5 million podcasts listed on their platforms. But when you dig into the stats, 25% of those podcasts have only released a show trailer, like episode 0. And then if you really dig in, it shows you that 46% of those podcasts have never released more than 10 episodes. So you're like, wow, okay, well, I fancy my chances then if half the field are just going to give up 10 weeks into their journey. And I remember it was the same when I was blogging, when I first started blogging and looking at all my competitors' websites, and I couldn't find anyone who'd gone beyond like the 4th month. They all kind of do the first 90 days, let's get the website live, let's get it up in the Google rankings, and then they give up. So you're just like, well, again, if all I've got to do is put something out every week, I can do that. Yes, it's as you'll know, it's a lot harder than people think than just, having a conversation and hitting a big red button that says record. It's a lot more difficult than that. But, you're right, massive spike, especially in the UK and Europe during the pandemic. And it was, that time when people were at home, people were looking at different ways to, I guess, communicate with people because we were all stuck at home.
But I also think, to your point, it's like, I would say it's probably more popular than radio because you get to pick what you listen to. It's just like having the
You take the
opportunity to
choice.
listen to
Yeah.
music. You get to, and then I think from the individual's perspective, it gives someone who's got something to talk about a microphone, and they don't have to be syndicated. They don't actually have to be on a radio or hired to get their point across, for good or for bad. But what I find in
Yeah, for good or
general.
for bad. Good point. Yeah. No, I think you're right. And I think it gives everybody the opportunity to have their own voice at the end of the day.
Mm.
And like you say, for better or worse in some cases, but you do have that opportunity. For me, the reason and my reasons have changed over the years, but initially it was to have conversations with people that I normally wouldn't be able to get in a room with, and it was an extension of me at the time doing live events for Virgin Startup, and I was inviting these entrepreneurs to come and speak to the audience that we'd built in like Brighton, London, Manchester, Bournemouth. And then I just thought, why don't we record this? And then it was like, okay, why don't we put it out there? And it was just one of those evenings that you know what it's like, absolutely breaking my back trying to get 100 people in a room in the middle of February on a dark, rainy, wet Wednesday evening, and then going home and seeing like over 1,000 people had actually listened to my podcast. Yet it taken me 4 weeks of nearly killing myself to get 100 people to a room, and you're like, wow. And it's like people all over the world are listening. Like now it's I think 181 countries we're in, and there's 195 in the world, something like that. So it's crazy. And I just think prior to this medium, Joy, that you would have had to have paid a fortune to take out ads in newspapers or on radio or TV to reach the audience that you're able to reach now. But instead, we've got the ability of a platform like StreamYard, where you could stream this live, of course, on YouTube or Facebook, etc. at the same
Which
time.
we're doing.
Fantastic. Exactly. So, it gives you that ability. It really does to touch and impact people and get your message across however you want to use this medium. Ultimately, help people do whatever the thing you're trying to help them to do. So, yeah, I think I'm with you. I think everybody should try, whether it's video, whether it's audio, whether it's the written word, or as you quite rightly say, podcasting gives you the ability to do all three. And the biggest trend in the industry, as you'll know, has been video podcasting in the last 18 months, 24 months. Things are about to get more exciting with YouTube rolling out their own dedicated podcast platform. I think it's similar play to what Spotify did, just to keep people's eyeballs on their platform.
Mm-hmm.
TikTok, I was at the podcast show back in May. TikTok saying the fastest growing content anywhere in the world right now on TikTok is podcasts. Is those 30-second clips to drive people to the longer form content.
Well, actually, I would love to talk about that, because one of the things I have found to be a little bit painful is the podcasts themselves. We know, we send out an email every week and we link to the podcast. We know people have the podcast already primed in their phone to download, and they listen to it every week. Like we know that. We have people who message us and support at techpixies.com and say, we love this episode. But every time we do anything on social, I've tried lots of different things. I've tried to do sort of like the original podcast promotion on social was the voiceover with like the image, and then that, the wave lines of talking.
Yeah.
That totally fell flat. And then we tried doing clips of the podcast interview, and that sort of fell flat. And then the only thing that seemed to work was if I did a reel, almost like a real preview. So it was like, hey, I just had a great chat with Alex Chisnell, and he was, it's all about how he went from, working as a flight attendant to Virgin to, running the startup program to now hosting one of the world's best podcasts, come and listen or whatever, but like, or my take on it, like the one key takeaway from this conversation. Yeah. And that seems to do that sort of takeaway sort of seems to do okay. We've also tried the carousel posts, with like a video of the podcast and then pictures. It just seems like the podcast promotion side falls flat, but once you've got listeners, they're very happy to listen and they really enjoy it. Do you have any thoughts on the podcast promotion side of things in terms of, any tricks and tips that I'm missing out on?
Yeah, good question for sure. And things come in cycles as to what's popular and what's not. And audiograms, as you said, with the audio wave through them were popular at one point. They're definitely not working very well at the moment. It's definitely what you said. It's the reels, and it's like the promo, the intro. But if you look at somebody like Alex Hormozi, for example, and I hate to say it because everybody mentions him as the go-to because it's the number one podcast in Europe, but Diary of a CEO, Stephen Bartlett, if you're using those clips and you're adding in some B-roll, which is what we do, and you're kind of leaving somebody. I think it's leaving somebody, you call it that kind of cliffhanger moment, but leaving them wanting to know more about that story.
That's
So
true. And actually, yeah, but I mean, okay, Alex Hormozi, Stephen Bartlett. I mean, Alex Hormozi said on YouTube, he said he has his social media team. He spends $85,000 a month on his team. So, for the person who's starting in podcasting, or even the person like who stuck it out, like me, who made it to 200 episodes, who's shown up consistently for 200 weeks, and who has like 100,000 downloads. When you don't have an 85,000 pound budget to promote yourself, I know that's a limiting belief, that I need an 85,000 pound monthly budget, which I don't need for sure. But one of the things we're saying is like, how could we replicate the trailer style? Because he does have I think Stephen Bartlett's basically copying the movie style, where, they give you just enough juice, and just enough interesting facts that you really want to pull. You 100%. Want to listen to the rest of it. And some of it's like the most sensationalist part of the interview, which I find interesting too, because his interviews are 2-3 hours long.
I know.
And when you speak to someone for that long, you're going to get a sensationalist piece come out, right? But when you do, like, let's say 30-minute interviews, let me talk about that too. So, okay, so that trailer style, it is working at the moment, and they're sort of, those two are leading the charge on it. They also have huge teams and huge budgets. So figuring out a way to be creative with the budget and the team you've got to make that happen is probably number one. But number two, what's your opinion on this? Like 5 minutes, 30 minutes, 2 hours? Like, where are we on this? I was doing hour-long ones, and I went to 30-minute ones, and that seems to sort of work for our audience and for me. But what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think it's a valid question. I think it's one of those ones, as you rightly kind of point out there, that it is, how long is a piece of string? You look at like Marketing School with Neil Patel and Eric Sue, and they're like 10 minutes daily episodes. You look at Stephen Bartlett now, or Joe Rogan, and they could be hours long. I started off, mine were like an hour and a half, but I'd had like 2 interviews within the one episode. I don't know why I tried to make things more difficult for myself starting out, but I did. Maybe that's something about my character. And I listened to my audience, and they were telling me they wanted shorter. So now I'm trying to aim for about 45 minutes from an hour's recording. But I think ultimately it comes down to 2 things. First one is, who is listening to your show? What is that ideal listener avatar? But more so than that even is, what are they doing when they're listening or watching your podcast? Like, if they're watching, they're obviously not doing a lot more, you'd think. But the beauty of podcasts, as we know, is that you can listen wherever you want, whenever you want them, and on whatever you want. So
that's a good point. Anyone who's watching live right now, I mean, obviously, if you're listening on replay, this isn't going to be an opportunity for you. But if you're watching live right now, we have live viewers right now. So tell us in the chat, in the comments, tell us how you're watching it, where you're watching it. I knowing my audience, I think a lot of them are doing it on a half an hour run in the morning. They're doing it like unloading the dishwasher. We've got mostly women between the ages of 40 and 60, and they're shuffling kids to and from. So it's dropping people here and dropping people there. Going, I remember a couple summers ago, my kids were in theater camp, and it was 45 minutes to camp, and I would they'd be in the car getting there, and then I'd be on my way on my own coming back, and I'd be listening to a podcast on the way back, or listening to some sort of online course on the way back. So, but I think, a lot of our audience, it's like that dog walk, or that run, or, that sort of laundry, which is so boring.
But it needs to be done. Having just got back from holiday, I know how many loads of washing that takes.
There we go. Jan says she's having a cuppa before she started sewing, and she's got a business where she makes all sorts of amazing things and then sells them. So that's a perfect example, right? So getting the day started. Claire Louise says she's watching from Bridlington on her mobile while catching up on emails. Oh, very good. So we're multitasking here, Claire Louise.
I like that. I like that. Yeah. And I think it's
And the others left because they're like, I don't want to say where I am and what I'm doing.
yeah. But I think you can, you can post, you could do a poll on LinkedIn, you could do a poll on your Instagram stories, you can literally list some options as to, what are people doing, and kind of, build out, like, obviously getting live feedback like this is invaluable, kind of building out that picture as to what your audience are doing. And then you kind of get an idea as to what they were doing. And when I changed mine was because I was getting feedback saying, I'm listening to the first interview, but my commute isn't long enough for an hour and a half to listen to the second one. So I'm getting in the car and I'm just hitting next episode. And I'm like, okay, that's
We're missing the
interesting.
second half of the first one.
Yeah, and also when we made the pod, we helped Grenade, the sports nutrition brand, with launching their podcast. And when we looked at the data, Al Barrett, the founder, was recording interviews again about an hour and 15, hour and 30. But when we looked at the data, which if you go into your Apple Podcasts, it will say how long people are listening for. And we saw with them that the drop off was after about 35 minutes. And I was like, don't want to dent your ego, but you either need to make them shorter or break them into two and do
I
episode
think
part
that's
one, part
it.
two.
I mean, if you're interviewing Jane Fonda and you're interviewing Michelle Obama, I mean, you need hours and hours and hours because they've got such incredible
if you can get
requests.
them, yeah.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think it's not to say that, and there are I would say one of the things about our podcast is we leverage it to connect with our community. So it's very rare that I let someone outside of our community come onto the podcast. Like, you are an exception. Usually they're men. I occasionally let them in because we don't have any men in our community.
I saw a few, on the episodes.
So
Yeah,
I made the exception for you, and there's a couple other men. Matt Mullenweg, I made an exception for him, and Paul Esri, and so I have a couple exceptions that I let on. But really, it's about people within the community getting to know the community, and also, the other thing too is I mean, women are so time poor anyway, and that's not a limiting belief. That's a fact.
Yeah.
I'm teasing. But the point is that there is a time poor element to my audience, and therefore a half an hour, if I can get a point across in a half an hour, I've done a really good job. And actually, the other part of this too was to challenge myself. I had a coach a couple years ago who she doesn't call herself time management coach. She calls herself a productivity coach. But one of the things she said is, your work will expand to fill the time you give it.
Yeah.
So, if you give your podcast 30 minutes or you give your podcast an hour, you are really going to expand what you talk about to fill that hour, or you're going to hone in on certain points to get them across in 30 minutes. And I think, that's super key is understanding how we also function. Am I someone who waffles and waffles and waffles, and I can't stop talking and I can't figure out how to get a point across? So I think the other thing too is, as I've podcasted over a couple of years now, I started in February of 2019. As I've been doing that, I've been able to get much clearer. And actually, sometimes I get to about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes. I'm like, okay, this podcast is done, because I got all the key juice out, because I've gotten better at asking questions.
Yeah.
So we talked about length. We've talked about promotion. What are your top tips on guests? Because one of the challenges I had with guests, I get a lot of requests. I mean, I get, like, every day I open up my inbox and I get flooded with requests. We even created a form so we could deal with it, but it's like I got hundreds of people on the form. And I suppose it's partly because we are consistent and we're going and everything else. But people will message me and want to be on the show. And I'm like, you're not in the UK. You don't speak to my audience. What you have to say, doesn't speak to my audience. So I just started ignoring most of the requests.
Yeah.
I don't, yours came through because it was very uniquely written. So I hope you don't mind if I read how yours was written out loud, because I think it'll help people. Because one of the things that we've not explored is how to get on podcasts. So I'd like to talk about two things: choosing guests and approaching guests, but then also getting onto podcasts, because I think one of the things that we need to do as a next move for our podcast is to start getting on other podcasts, where we're getting lots of requests, but we're not putting a lot of requests out there. So I think your request was one of the best requests I've ever seen. And like I said, it's very rare that I let anyone on the podcast that's not.
Thank you again.
So here's what he said. He said, hello, Joy. I'm writing to ask if you'd be interested in featuring me and my story as a guest on your show. Amongst many other things, I'm a podcast host and entrepreneur. When I launched, so connected already immediately to who I am.
Yeah.
When I launched the podcast 6 years ago, no one listened except for my wife and mom. I already had 3 failed businesses. Again, totally connected to me. This is my 3rd business. My first 2 weren't super successful. And I also know what it's like to only have 2 listeners. I feared this would be a 4th. And then you said today, Screw It, Just Do It is in the top 1% of all global podcasts with listeners in 180 plus countries. So you identified with something, the starting point, and then fed into where you are now, which gives you authority. And then you said, I'm interviewing media personalities, sports stars, and entrepreneurs of multi-million-dollar businesses. So that's talking about your show. And then you say, I've gone from working as a flight attendant for Virgin Atlantic to becoming Sir Richard Branson's #1 business advisor at Virgin Startup and having Virgin Atlantic sponsor my show. So again, this sort of like this really cool part of your story, which of course we led with in this podcast because people in the UK recognize who Richard Branson is. And then you go on and say some other things, but you also say, I promise to share your show with my followers across social media. And you give, your following number and some statistics. Then you say, if you believe I'm a good fit for your audience and you'd like to have me on your show, please take a look at the attached media kit. I didn't even look at the media kit. The letter sort of got me.
Interesting.
But what was interesting to me was you were the first person who offered to cross promote the podcast. So a lot of times when someone approaches me, first of all, they're like, they have an agent approach me, so it's not from them. And whether you actually sent it or not, I don't know. It doesn't really matter. What matters is the letter came from you.
Yeah.
But then secondly, what was interesting about it was you offered to share it with your audience. And I have not seen that very much. And on our form, we actually say to people, do you have a podcast? How many, downloads do you have? Will you, do you have a mailing list? How many people are on your mailing list? Will you share it with your audience? Because it's sort of like it's not a reciprocal relationship. So
absolutely.
Yeah, let's talk about getting guests and then becoming a guest. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so getting guests. So what I've learned over the years has been a few things. So what I start with now and how we start with every client that we work with is start out with your Dream 100 list. Like if your podcast goes for 10 years, who would you want to interview? And I got this from interviewing Evan Carmichael, who people may know, may not know, has a super popular YouTube channel, Canadian guy. And he said that at the top of his list was Tony Robbins. Okay. And he said, he manifested getting Tony Robbins on his show. Not only manifested that, but actually ended up launching a business with Tony Robbins. And his tactic was to go on to, for example, their Instagram channel, look at who they were following. And it's usually a tiny percentage of people that they're following in comparison to their millions of followers, and approaching some of the people they follow and starting small, but playing with the long game in mind, getting them as guests on his show. So that
like on LinkedIn, like your third connection to your second connection to your first connection.
So climbing up the ladder so that when he does get in the door with Tony Robbins is like, why the hell haven't you got me on your show? You've got Jane, you've got Joe, you've got Joy, you've got Alex. And I just thought that was a great story. And
that is a brilliant story.
You got him on your show. He said, not only have I got him on my show, but we're now going into business together. And I was like, get the hell out of here. That's unbelievable. So that is a tactic.
So start with your, so you called it your what 100?
So Dream 100 list.
Dream 100. I've heard that term before. Yeah. So your Dream 100.
So just a spreadsheet with the names of who you want, and I would have all of their social media platforms, so where they hang out, where their audience is, any contact details you can get for them. And for me,
it's interesting because Alex, I did sit down to create a Dream 100, and I could only think of at the time 3 names that I wanted, and all 3 people came onto my podcast.
Wow.
So Amy Porterfield, Stu McLaren, and Jeff Walker, all 3 have been on my podcast.
You had Amy on, have you? I didn't know that.
I did. I got Amy on, and Amy, it was reciprocal. She interviewed me too. I hope
you're promoting that still a lot. Every quarter that you post that out. That's what I'll be doing. Well, most people don't promote their past episodes enough.
And I'm laughing because I don't promote my past episodes. So let's come back to that. So let's talk about guests and then come back to promote. And then hopefully you can run over about 5 minutes, but we'll.
Sure.
Okay.
No problem.
So
yeah, and I would say, if you're starting out, I would have two lists. I would have a Dream 100, and then I would have if I'm starting my podcast in the next 90 days, for example, who could I call on? Who's my first connection, or who does my inner circle have a connection with? And you'll soon see, again, by just looking at who they follow on social media and then seeing if they follow them back, etc. Simple things like that. Another tip I would give would be approaching agencies. And again, I learned that by agencies approaching me, because PR agencies, marketing agencies, they're all looking to promote people. So if you can get on, that's how I ended up getting Lewis Howes on my show, for example. It was, it took me a year, but initially not interested. But when his second book was coming out, he was looking to do a podcast tour. He's trying to get on as many podcasts as possible in different countries. So for me, it's, and again, reaching out to all these agencies, but starting small, giving what they give you as to who's open to an interview. And it's usually if they're launching something new, a new book, a new album, a new show, whatever it is. So agencies is a really good one. Your inner circle is a really good one, because you'll be surprised at who knows who if you actually start sharing it. Write it down by putting it on your Dream 100, then start sharing it with people. I won't go into the whole manifestation thing, but that's part of that, is how you can actually manifest, these guests and get them on your show. So those are 3 tips I would say to get guests on your show.
Yeah. So agencies, inner circle, and what was the third one?
And the third one being the Evan Carmichael thing of going on to people's who they're following on social media
and finding out who they're connected to.
Yeah.
And actually, I think you could also do that with LinkedIn in terms of depending on what I mean, that's Instagram, but there's also 100%. LinkedIn for a lot of people. That's really interesting. And podcasting is super key for promotion of books.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, and who did I get on during the pandemic? It was really interesting because it was the author of Chicken Soup for the Soul, sold more books than J.K. Rowling. Forgotten his bloody name now. But they approached me and they were like, normally we would be going to Europe and doing a book tour. We can't. We want to do a podcast tour instead. Can we be on your show? And I'm like, oh my God, of course you could be on my show. And then he before I even, another great way is to ask for recommendations. That's the one. And instead of, I would always ask guests at the end of my podcast to recommend someone who they think would be a great fit for my show. Before I'd even finished, he had said to me, I've got 3 amazing guests for your show, Alec. I thought, you're a complete pro. You're a complete pro. And one of those was Evan Carmichael. That's what led me into that story.
Wow.
He's giving me really good connections. So, again, if you started your podcast, ask someone for a recommendation, because they'll always want to make themselves look good. So they're always going to recommend somebody that's pretty impressive, rather than somebody who you might never heard of, or, hasn't done anything, that doesn't have a story, is not interested in promoting themselves even, or coming on a podcast,
And do you ask them, you don't ask that to them? Well, I suppose you don't do do you do live video podcasts, or do you do that?
Not anymore. Yeah. Did during the pandemic, but now, record them, but I will ask them as part of the recording, but we'll just clip that out as part of the edit, and then I'll follow it up with an email, because most people go, oh my God, I'll have to think about that.
Yeah. Okay. And then in terms of promoting past podcasts, I'd love for your opinion on that.
Yeah. So again, and it doesn't have to be like this. Like, we just started doing like a Throwback Thursday episode, and it's looking at those past episodes. And for me, it's like, okay, who's current and relevant at the moment? Okay, I've interviewed Stephen Bartlett, who's now got the #1 podcast in Europe. Why the hell aren't we promoting that interview? Lewis Howes is just launching his 3rd book. Why aren't we promoting that episode? People like that. Again, having a spreadsheet, having a list of your past guests, having the topics that they've talked about, things like that. If you've got the time to do that starting out, that's going to save you a whole bunch of time further down the line.
And you're not republishing the episodes, you're just re-promoting them via email or social.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I would do all of those things. I would do social like once a week or twice a week, even if you've got space in your social media calendar to promote past episodes. And you're not necessarily just promoting the name of the guest, you're promoting different topics. And within that, there is the guest. But also in your weekly newsletter, there could be a throwback episode if you're new, because this, everybody joins your podcast at a different stage in their journey. Episode 1, episode 200, for example, episode 100. So they might not have the time to go back into your back catalogue and discover some of these amazing guests you've had. So you're just reintroducing them to those guests. And as long as I think it's timely and it's relevant, why wouldn't you do it?
I love it. And final thoughts on guest or gifts at the end of, like, when you have a guest, do you send gifts? How do you make sure they feel like, it's not very common these days unless you're at the really top end where you would pay someone to be a guest on your
Yeah.
podcast. But what are your thoughts about sort of keeping your guests happy and making sure they remember you?
Do you know what? That is a fantastic question, and it's a question we've revisited recently because we're relaunching my podcast in October, and it was something a past mentor said to me. She said to me, "Alex, do you know the most valuable thing you've got?" And before I'd even spoken, she was like, "It's not your podcast, it's not your podcast agency, it's the network that you've built through your podcast." And she said, "And what are you doing about it?" And I was like, I'm not. Pre-pandemic, I was doing an annual event, and we did like 2 years, and then the pandemic hit, and we'd have 250 people. We'd have great speakers a whole day, and that's something that we've literally revisited in the last month. It's like, one, can we send them something relevant to the show? So looking at merchandise for the show, but something personal. So more so than just here's the here's the mug of the show. That's not going to do it. Let's make it personal and relevant to them. So let's spend some time thinking about that. And then what can we build that's maybe an annual event and it's invite only, and we know that only a percentage are going to be able to make it. But what can we do? Because what surprised me was that someone who'd been on my show who'd been an investor in Dragon's Den asked me for an introduction to another guest who just sold their business for a couple of £100 million. And I assumed they'd know each other because, as you'll know, the entrepreneurship community in the UK is a lot smaller than you actually think it is. And they didn't know each other. So I just thought, how many more people, if I put the past guests of the show in a room, would have something in common, that there would be something relevant? Maybe it's an investment opportunity. Maybe it's the guest on their podcast, whatever it might be. What can we do? So that's something that I'm thinking about now that we've just revisited. So I would think it doesn't have to be an in-person event. It can be an online event. What can you do to bring that community together to keep them relevant and not, those guests from 6 years ago? How can you keep them relevant? How can you be of value to them? And I think that's through being regular communication is the only way to do it, personally.
Yeah, staying connected to them.
Staying connected.
Well, I appreciate that we've gone over the time and that you've given us that extra time.
No problem.
I'm a big fan of encouraging women to overcome their fear of getting their message out there, that their message is more important than their fear, that the gifts that we have to give the world really make a big difference. And we start by using our voice and in video and social media and email. And that's a big thing for me, is helping women to really get the courage and the strength to be brave and speak up. And podcasting is one of the ways to do that. Do you have any final thoughts on podcasting? And also, where can people find you?
Yeah, I'll leave you with this one, and it just popped into my mind when you said those last couple of lines, was that people when I had my own podcast, people were asking me for advice, so I decided to host a workshop in Bournemouth, and that workshop, I think we had 18 people come, and there were 16 women and one man, and just chatting to everybody afterwards ultimately led me to launching the podcast agency, because some of the commonalities around that were women coming back from having had kids, women coming back into employment, and a lot of the challenges were imposter syndrome, not feeling that they were heard. And for me, that empowered me to then go and launch my podcast agency, because all of these ladies wanted to start their own podcast, but they wanted to learn how to do it. They wanted to do it in the correct way. They wanted to have it organized, etc. But I think more so than that, they just wanted the confidence and someone to say, just do it. Just go ahead and do it. What have you got to lose? Screw it, just do it. Boom, we said it. And then, easiest way for me would be, you can go and listen to my podcast. Screw it, just do it. Otherwise, I'm at Alex Chisnell on every platform except Instagram, where it's at Alex Chisnell _. But you'll find me everywhere, or you can email me, alex@screwitjustdoit.org.
And we've got some great comments here. Claire Louise says, I haven't really thought about podcasts, but after this, I'm certainly considering it for the future. Thank you. And Pina says, love this. Thank you, Joy. Thank you, Alex. And I do want to say a huge thank you to you. I am celebrating hitting our 200th episode by
Amazing. Well done.
doing a podcast on podcasts. There was a time I remember when I logged in and there were like 64,000 downloads. I was like, this is taking forever. And I was like, I'm going to quit. And then I decided I'll just keep going a little bit longer. And then suddenly we were at 75,000. I was like, well, if I can get to 75,000, I can get to 100,000.
Yep.
And we should be hitting around 100,000 right when this episode releases. So I am super grateful to you for coming on and talking about something that I took a chance on, I took a punt on, and it was really Amy Porterfield who said to me in 2019, you need to do a podcast because that's the way things are going. And I sort of took her as the authority, and she is quite the authority. So I listened to what she said and did it. And it's been very, very important for our business on many, many aspects. Being able to share the story of amazing stories of our alumni who have done incredible things, but also just to tackle the issues that you're talking about: imposter syndrome, perfectionism, compare and despair, failure, negative feedback, all the things that women face when they start to speak up. So I'm super, super grateful. And thanks again for the extra time. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.
Absolute pleasure. And again, thank you for having me on, and congratulations on hitting episode 200. Consistency is key.
And it's great you said key, because most people say consistency is king, and then I say, well, maybe it's queen.
Love it.
Key's quite neutral. I like it.
Yeah, it is.
All right. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Joy.
All right. Well, that was fantastic. I really, really loved that interview. Just wonderful that people give us time to talk about things that they have been able to master. I mean, he is a podcast master. He's in one of the top 200 podcasts in the world. They have an audience all over the world, 180 countries, and in the top 1% of all podcasts. And that doesn't come easily, but it does come with one episode followed after another episode, followed after another episode, followed after another episode. And as you can see, he's created systems and processes by which he's been able to develop his podcast. And we're in the process of doing that as well. I'm as a person who believes very strongly that we are a spiritual being in a human body, and we want to be forever freer. We want to forever expand. We want to forever grow. A huge part of this journey for me is setting goals, achieving them, and moving on to new ones. And so as we hit our 200th episode, and as we hit 100,000 downloads, I'm setting new goals, new SMART goals, something that's specific, measurable, actionable. I think I like the actionable rather than accountable, although accountable is important as well, or even achievable, right? I'm a big fan when you're leaning into SMART goals that action speaks louder than anything else, right? So actionable and, resonant, as my friend Jess says, and thrilling, something that, setting a goal, a bigger goal that's exciting, that pushes you out of your comfort zone and moves you into a new place. So I am grateful that I didn't quit podcasting when I could have. I'm grateful that I stuck with it. The incredible stories that we've been able to tell on this podcast, man, oh man, and we've got some really good ones coming up for you in the next few weeks as well. It's a wonderful place for me to tell my story, to share the stories of others, to talk about the impact that Tech Pixies has in the world. So if you are thinking about starting a podcast and you have no idea where to start, we have a free guide. If you go to techpixies.com/podcast, you can grab our free guide and you can learn exactly how I did it. I literally wrote a document as I was doing it. And so, if you want to know exactly how I did it, it's actually a relatively simple process, and I give you to you step by step, click by click, exactly how I did it. Totally the Tech Pixie way. And so if you want to go and do that, that would be great. It also gets you onto our mailing list, and then you'll get our podcast on a regular basis. All we ask is that you subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. And I read every review. They're beautiful. They touch my heart. And of course, anytime anyone emails into support@techpixies.com to say that a podcast episode inspired them, that makes me even happier. One of our last episodes, which was most recent episodes, which was with Louise Bailey, I got a message from someone who then went on to one of the companies that Louise Bailey had worked for and found a job there and applied for a job. So you never know what the podcast is going to do. And if it touches one person's life, it makes one person's life better, gives them an insight they didn't have before, then it's done its job. So I want to say thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. If you have been one of the loyal podcast listeners from day one, I am super, super grateful. And if you're a brand new podcast listener and you're just getting to know our podcast and our company, Tech Pixies, and the work that we do, it's a pleasure and an honor to have you here with us today. And I think we have at least inspired one person to think about podcasting. And actually two. Jan's also said she's enjoyed this and she's certainly going to think about podcasting. And Pina says, thank you for inspiring me to think about podcasts too. Yeah, it's a great storytelling mechanism. And I think it trumps radio because you get to choose what you listen to rather than just listen to whatever people want to talk about. All right. Have a fantastic day, the rest of your week, or if it's the start of your week or the start of your weekend, wherever you are listening to this, however you are listening to this. I hope it's had a wonderful impact on you. And of course, if it has, please let us know at support@techpixies.com. And if you'd like to let us know how you listen to it and where you listen to it, we would love that too. Of course, don't send us any pictures of you in the bath, although I do know that's another place that most people listen to podcasts because that's where I listen to mine. Speak to you later. Bye.